Coorhagen is the home of Kain, and despite being a fairly large settlement, it houses relatively few actual houses that we can enter, with the majority taken up by 3 sprawling underground dungeons. In the Alpha, this is one of the more interesting areas due to the presence of some unexpected spells, but we'll come to those later. The road to Coorhagen in the retail version starts in Bazielim, with its northeastern exit trail blocked by a pair of standing stones, which require the mace to break through and reach a trail going northward to Coorhagen. In the Alpha, however, though this trail is still present, it's perhaps not the expected route to use to continue to Coorhagen. The new exit route of Naprapla's retreat puts us on a different route behind Bazielim, which eventually meets up with the Bazielim to Coorhagen trail outside a Blood Fountain cave. The spur which led to the retreat exit is still present in retail and is reused to host a series of power-ups behind a standing stone, but the trail itself goes no further and terminates here.
The blood of ages flows so sweet. Come, drink from us.
Interestingly, the blood fountain seen here is different, giving immunity to rain, whereas the retail version gives magic energy recovery.
The rain will do you no harm, for our blood preserves. Our blood enhances, our blood preserves, our blood heals, for the blood is the life.
Moving up, the trail is much the same, although missing vista points for audio dialogue and with some alteration of signposts. Partway along, we get a cave, which in retail is a moon cave, that leads to the Font of Putrescence Spirit Forge. Like previous forges, it has a simpler square antechamber that is changed into a longer corridor in retail, but the actual forge itself is much the same.
Shed your blood for me, and these artifacts will be yours. So, you come to the Spirit Forge for help, do you, vampire? Trade your secrets for the blood of the dead, I will.
Before we reach the end of the trails, there's a house, which is the same in both versions of the game. The exterior of Coorhagen is virtually identical to the retail game. There are a few variations in house style, but the overall layout and progression is almost the same, with only a few differences in things like enemy types and the presence or rather lack of audio vistas and associated dialogue. Like other towns, Kwarhagen also has some similarities with its interiors, with both the first and second interiors being the same as retail. However, the really interesting stuff happens when we get to the first dungeon. In the retail version of the game, this was the repel dungeon, where Kain would gain the somewhat overpowered reflective repel spell. However, this is not the case in the alpha, and instead of repel, Kain gains two previously unknown spells, Force Shield and Magic Absorb. In terms of function, these act more like basic versions of repel, with both represented by coloured hexagonal boxes that manifest around Kain. The red Force Shield provided him with temporary protection against physical attacks, and the blue Magic Absorb spell protected him from magical and projectile attacks. In terms of layout, the Force Shield Magic Absorb dungeon was similar to the retail repel dungeon, with many of the rooms being much the same, although there were also lots of layout changes and room reshuffling. The initial area encountered in the alpha is a room full of beds and bodies which is removed from the retail version of the game. The save altar area was a completely different room, consisting of a building interior with the repel mural in retail. The alpha version is instead in a cave, with murals of both Force Shield and Magic Absorb. After the save altar, a corridor leads to the main chamber of the dungeon. The heart of the dungeon in both alpha and retail is a large two-tiered chamber, with which Kain progresses through the bottom areas and then returns on a higher level to collect the spell. However, this is slightly different in the alpha, in that the Force Shield is placed across his path in the bottom corridors.
With the Force Shield active, no physical or mundane weapon can damage my person. A powerful armor, yes, but a temporary one, and one fueled by my own energy.
Apart from minor differences to shooters, doorways and enemies, the room is much the same between versions. After the main room, a pair of square-shaped chambers leads away from the main room, and leads to a chamber resembling the initial save altar. In the retail version, it's the same room with another door opening, but the alpha returns us to a similar cave area, although missing the save altar. Progressing on puts us through a reverse C-shaped corridor, which again leads out to the main room, this time along the top level, to where Magic Absorb can be found in much the same position as Repel would be in the final game.
When invoked, this magic shrouds my body in an energy-absorbing shell, protecting me from many types of spells for a time.
A straight corridor and a square room lead the way to the final cave, again with illustrations of the two spells. In the retail, the straight corridor was made into an L-shaped room, and the final room was an interior building room with a pile of bodies. Throughout the dungeon, it was evident that many rooms had been reshuffled and combined, and some coding suggested that some had been modified or replaced. Despite its absence here, the repel spell did make an appearance in the alpha. It appears later in the game in a previously unknown dungeon on the way to Dark Eden that shares much of the aesthetics of the Bone Armor dungeon. We'll visit that dungeon later on. Ultimately, it appears that Force Shield and Magic Absorb were planned to be two separate spells that would be combined and upgraded into a common repel spell later in the story. But the idea was dropped, and the two lesser abilities removed, with the common repel ability moved to an earlier, more complete dungeon. But this was not without its hangovers, as the developer's level select lists the retail repel dungeon as SH. While it could be presumed this was related to it being a shield ability, the alpha shows the dungeon was originally listed there as SHAB, relating to both the Force Shield and the Magic Absorb abilities. The later Repel dungeon has its own listing, under REPL, which of course disappears in the retail version. We'll cover more of the Repel dungeon reshuffle when we get to Dark Eden, but for now, we'll continue further into Coorhagen, and the Bone Armor and Inspire Hate dungeons. Join us next time for those.